好，我们现在陆续还有这个朋友们上线啊，但是我们已经7:33了，我们就不等了，所以我们今天的讲座就正式开始。今天呢，是我们事务所在2023年的时候最后一次和大家去做讲座。那今天呢，我们主要的讲座的内容呢，是给大家做一下这个年末的资产方面规划，就是和大家聊聊天吧。我和 Michael 利律师啊，因为我们做讲座大概做了1年的时间，把一些我们认为的在年末的最重点的一些内容呢，跟大家去讲一下。那在今天讲座之前呢，我还是请 Michael 利律师先自我介绍一下，然后我也跟大家自我介绍一下，就是如果有新朋友的话，也可以了解一下我们。
Hi, greetings all. Happy holidays. I'm Mike Lee. I'm one of the founders of the firm. So I'm an estate planning tax attorney. So we handle estate planning, wills, trusts, powers of attorney, healthcare directives, probate administration, trust administration, and tax planning. And we're getting towards the end of the year, so that's nice, our last seminar of the year.
好的，谢谢 Michael。Michael 利律师呢，刚才自我介绍了一下啊。那我是我们事务所的李小薇律师。我和 Michael 利律师呢，我们两个人都是长期从事于遗产传承、资产传承方面的律师。那如果说呢，您在遗产继承、遗产税规划、资产传承方面有任何的问题呢，我们非常愿意帮大家呢去做任何的这方面问题的一个解答和咨询啊。那在今天呢，我们开始我们讲座的正式的话题的开始之前呢，我想跟大家聊一个，就是我们的老规矩，反正每一次讲座之前就会和大家聊一下我们认为的这一个月，我们从我们的这个 practice area 来讲的话，我觉得非常重要的一些热点话题啊。那这个月呢，我觉得其实我和 Michael 利律师，我们都觉得说有一个事情其实是让我们觉得说可以这个拿出来和大家去分享一下，去说一下的，就是关于金融诈骗这方面的问题。因为这个月就是尤其中国大陆，我看了好多这个报道啊，就是在缅北果敢地区，他们有一些金融诈骗集团这样的，电信诈骗被这个就是一定程度上得到了一定的打压。因为我觉得其实在过去的很多年以内，我们大家都觉得，就是不仅是中国大陆，我觉得其实在美国，我自己本身也收到了好多这方面的信息，甚至 Michael 律师，这个也在他的电话当中也收到过一些信息，就是所谓的这个杀猪盘，就各种盘这样的这个金融诈骗的短信啊、邮件，这就不用说了，这个这么多年一直都是有的。那我想请这个 Michael 律师简单的给我们介绍一下，在我们 practice 当中，好像 we also saw a lot of this kind of problems, right? Like in our everyday practice. Can you give our audience a brief introduction of financial fraud?
Yes, so this is a major problem throughout the world. Shall I gave an example, and everybody has seen in the news. And from our practice, even out here in Silicon Valley, I've been surprised to encounter it. So we have encountered clients really over the last 2 years. Falling victim to affinity frauds, and affinity frauds is usually that you have some relationship, but it's a false relationship. It's something that the fraudster tries to create a relationship. Like what they will do nowadays with the higher technology and using social media, they can get a little bit of a feel and understanding for you. LinkedIn, Facebook, all these things. They look at LinkedIn, they know where you work, they know where you used to work, they know where you went to school, they know what degrees you got. Then they go over to Facebook and they know that, you're married or you're divorced, you have 2 kids, you have 1 kid, you have a brother, you have a sister. They figured this all out. And this is the interesting thing with the walk on these scam centers, that it was not as random. The people would kind of stalk the person and figure out their backstory, and then when they approached to commit the fraud, they were believable. and they would say, "Oh, Mike, don't you remember we went to school together in Los Angeles back then? I'm moving to the Bay Area. Can you tell me a little bit about the Bay Area?" We start talking, and they say, "Okay, I'm going to come to the Bay Area. We're going to do this. Could you give me, some recommendations of different things?" And they would start this approach, and then eventually they pose the trap, and the trap is usually, can you assist me with something? And it will be couched as something that it will be an exchange or an investment or something like that. And I know everybody on the call says, "Oh, Mike, I wouldn't fall for that. I'd be prepared." And I've been surprised myself. We've had a number of clients that approach us, intelligent, sophisticated people that get scammed by these things. And the ones that we've seen as the person or the scammer claim to be a friend from the past, and so they break down the border of security by claiming that they're a friend from the past, and then because of these new things, and this is varied over time, but the new one is the cryptocurrency is the new one. 9 months ago or a year ago, it was the marijuana industry. These things that they say, "Oh, I have this great business opportunity. Come in with me, and we'll do these things, and I'll increase your wealth." They also understand people pretty well, and Photoshop, and they will appear as a very handsome man, a very charming woman, and they'll approach and say, "Oh, we're friends from the past," and in ways you wouldn't expect. That, again, like for hate to say someone my age, they won't pose as the 19-year-old girl. They'll pose as you say 40s, but say but charming. I'm divorced, but we're from the past. Things believable, and that people will get interested in. So this combination of them knowing more about you, knowing the technology, and then deploying the scam is very prevalent. And then we've had to do work on two things. One is, if you are a victim of crime, fraud, loss, and it's a reportable loss, that's crime, fraud, you can claim tax loss for that. So we've done work to do that, to claim as crime victim losses can sometimes occur there. There's also a lot of reporting,
Or
some insurance
unfortunately, actually bankruptcy. We did
and
that
bankruptcy.
too. Some of our clients that got really into trouble because they transfer a lot of money into these fraudsters, and then they have
Well,
no money and they to pay for their mortgage, and they have to
well,
apply for bankruptcy.
this is the one. The fraud that we saw was that the fraudster said, "Oh, I have this method," because again, they know you. So the person said, "Well, remember when we were at MIT together? I'm Shane. Remember from MIT? Remember you sat in the front, I sat in the back. That thing that was getting developed. You were doing computer science with that thing, and well, I went the other way. I did crypto, and I have a way that I can double the money, in an afternoon." And so all we need is cash. And look at these returns. It's all bogus, but they have a good sale. And we had the client that basically the person said, "Well, you know what you need to do? You need to go to your bank and you need to borrow this money. Go get this money." And what the person did is they went to a number of lenders, which the scammer put them in touch with, and accrued all of these debts. And it was very hard to claim that the lender had any knowledge of this. They didn't. Bank of America had no idea that this was not that was the bank, but these third-party lenders, the person who was just approaching as a borrower and borrowed the money, and they accrued substantial debt as opposed to fraud. And they have a defense to the fraudster, but they have no defense to the lender. The lender says, whether you borrowed the money and gave it to a fraudster, or you borrowed the money and you helped your sick brother, or you borrowed the money and you built an addition to your house, whatever you did, that doesn't matter between you and me. All that matters is that you borrowed it. And so we had bankruptcy work for that. So it is an interesting twist that we're seeing, and relaying this of what we're seeing in the wild of scammers being far more intelligent of knowing you, approaching in a different way, and then using the technology to make the transaction more clever or less transparent than what we've seen. A lot of our clients think, oh, that's kind of for old people. That's like the nurse at the, nursing home tricking you. And yeah, there's plenty of that out there. We get plenty of that. But we're having some some clients dealing with issues that we'd say, I'm a little bit surprised by this one.
所以就是这么多年来，我们职业以来就看到真的是各种各样类型的金融诈骗，就是当然刚才 Michael 也讲了，最常见的有一些像我们接触的，就是年纪大一点的人，涉及到的一些金融诈骗，比如说就是其实在加州这边的话，它是有一些专门的一些法律哈，就是尤其是跟 elder abuse。之前我们的讲座我们也有跟大家讲，就 elder abuse 有一种就是实际上是 financial abuse， 就更常见的是一些金融方面的这方面的 abuse， 而并不是说就是 physically 就是打人呐、暴力啊这种性质反而是更少一些。那比如说这个老人的 caretaker， 包括就这个老人的一些甚至是这个配偶啊、子女去违背老人的意愿去做一些，比如说篡改银行账户、改变受益人，像这样的一些行为啊，这个就是甚至是伪造这个遗嘱 （estate planning documents） 这些，这个我们都是见到过的。那到这个就是广义的面上的话，就是我们也这么多年也接触过的，有一些客户就是经历过一些比如说大家都听说过的这个庞氏骗局，Ponzi scheme。庞氏骗局的话，这个实际上就是在我们湾区也有很多就是不同的，就是小规模范围内的。
FTX.
Yes, yeah, yes, exactly. 对，也算是一个庞氏骗局。这个是大规模的，但就是湾区有的时候是这种小规模的，经常有的时候是，比如说大家都是同一个同乡，或者说是同一个 relation，或者是有一些共同，像 Michael 讲的校友会啊这样的，就是这样的有一些共同的基础，那这样有的时候人就会变得特别的 vulnerable，然后陷入到一些骗局里面。那这其中就是如果是投资类的话，就是像这种庞氏骗局就比较突出啊。那还有后来有一些什么所谓的这个投资一些石油骗局，然后比特币这些，然后到现在有一些这个金融电信诈骗。这个有一些莫名其妙的一些这个投资的这个，但是其实就是就像 Michael 讲的，就是很多受骗的人，其实他并不是说就是在我们看来就是说哎。就是外人看来可能就觉得说你怎么会去受骗？但是实际上就是你在当下的时候，这个骗子他是对你研究的是非常的透彻的，所以他非常了解你，他抓住了你的弱点或者怎样。那所以在这个过程当中，很多人就受骗了。那我们因为 Michael 律师呢，他同时也是破产法专家，就是加州法庭认证的这个破产法专家，所以其实呢，我们也有帮助一些客户很不幸的申请过破产，因为他把很多很多的资产都转给了骗子，那造成了说他自己这个金融上陷入了很大的危机，不得不申请破产保护这样的一些事件。那其实呢，下个月呢，我们也会专门办一场这样的一个讲座啊，具体的跟大家讲一下，有一些我们这么多年接触的一些这个金融诈骗类型，以及如何去防止这些诈骗。如果说您有兴趣的话呢，也欢迎大家就是这个在下个月就是新年的第一期的讲座啊，欢迎您在这个线上参加我们的讲座。那说到我们今天的这个正题吧，这个今天我们正题就跟大家聊聊天，因为我们今天也没有特别去准备任何的 slides 啊什么的，就是说，想和大家放松的去聊一下，就是说我们认为从遗产财产规划方面，Michael，do you have anything to add before we go to our general topic?
Two things before we jump into the general topic. Just one thing about frauds and scams and these problems that pivots into estate planning, which is also very important, is this was about elder abuse and changes to an elder person's estate plan. And here's a technique that for everybody on our Zoom to remember for dealing with older parents or older friends and things like that, is if you have someone that is an older person doing estate planning, particularly if they're doing an estate plan and you are not going to go with a distribution scheme that looks like the intestate distribution. So if I have 3 children and law will assume that I should do a third, a third, a third. If I say none to my 2 sons, all to my daughter, who lives with me and takes care of me and is the person I'm close with. At first, that seems like, well, of course, because she lives with me and takes care of me. But that also creates a specter or concern of undue influence, that she is whispering into dad's ear and says, Tim never, he doesn't like you. That's why he never comes to visit, even though she says that I'm too sick to see him or something. And there's always this concern that there's some problem with undue influence. So how can you deal with this in the estate plan is essentially there is a process called a certificate of independent review. And this is generally the first attorney. If we're the drafting attorneys, we draft the estate plan. We do this, we listen to the client and we draft the estate plan and say, well, why do you only want your daughter? And you say, the person says, well, I live with my daughter. My daughter spends 24 hours a day taking care of me. That's way more than I could ask. She has, even her husband's living here and, he doesn't want to live with me, but, they're taking care of me. I really appreciate it. So they should get the estate. And I say, and you do know you have 2 sons. I said, yeah, I know. And one's a doctor and the other guy's he's an astronaut, so they don't need any money. They're fine. And then you say, okay, yeah, I get it. And your daughter retired early to take care of you. Okay, yeah, okay, makes sense. That's the plan. What you then do is that they say, and if you want to help alleviate this issue of questions about capacity and why you made this choice, in 2 weeks to 4 weeks, go see my colleague XYZ lawyer, who I know. I'll send them the estate plan. That person's going to interview you again alone, privately, without your daughter, and double check this. And then they will issue a certificate of independent review, or vice versa. The plan's done by somebody else, and then we do the independent review. It's not terribly expensive, but it essentially can insulate the estate plan from challenges by, let's say, the 2 sons that say, oh, dad clearly was under was mesmerized by by May. May always had control over dad, and she still did. And then she had him do, 100% to her, not a third. So that certificate of independent review is something to keep in mind for older family members, because sometimes we get approached by the children that say, okay, I want to take care of, my father or mother. And then we generally have to ask and say, well, what's the distribution pattern? Oh, does it match intestate distribution? Okay, well, I'm less concerned. It's even and fair. And what would happen if they did nothing? It's just avoids probate and is more efficient. But if we do something different, it's usually good to have a certificate of independent review. Just one other tiny pivot, and I'll be fast, is I was nearly the victim of a scam that was perpetuated by lawyers, or perpetuated on lawyers. And I want to mention it because it's clever. And I see this scam being redone in the Chinese American community, but it's done in a different way. So the way this scam worked with lawyers is we'd be approached by a potential client, and they would ask for a very, very inexpensive legal service. Like they'd say, oh, I'm a designer, I'm an architect. Usually it was I'm an architect, or I'm some sort of designer or something like this. I did all of this work for this beautiful house. Here's the address and here's the name of the person. And it would be some, gigantic, Atherton house or something like that. And Zillow would show the beautiful interior and everything. They say, I'm owed money. I'm owed, $200,000 by this person. Can you write a demand letter? And I'll sign a contingency agreement with you that I'll give you, because they always got to sweeten it and make the lawyer do it. I'll give you 40% if they pay. And a lot, I'll tell you, lawyers' ego and interest in money, they'll say, oh, yeah, okay, a 40% contingency agreement, and all I have to do is write a letter? Sure. So you write the letter and you FedEx it over to the Atherton house. And lo and behold, powerful lawyer that everybody's afraid of, you send a letter and you get results. You get a check, a cashier's check for $200,000. The check's bogus, but they know, the scammers know, you have to deposit that check into your attorney-client trust account. You deposit it into the attorney-client trust account. Then suddenly the client pops up and says, oh, I urgently need the money. Did you get paid? Did you get the money? And they say, yeah, I got paid. They say, oh, was it good funds? They say, yeah, it was cashier's check. They say, oh, that's good as cash. That's good as cash. Wire from your trust account to me right now, right now, right now. You have to do it right now. And of course, lawyers get overexcited. Then they of course, they see 200,000, they wire out the 120 or so out to the client and think, what a smart lawyer. I'm so powerful. And I got 80,000 bucks. The check bounces. And you bounced a check on a trust account, which you can never do. And the trust account also, not only does it bounce, you've overdrawn the trust account, which you can never do. And many lawyers, because this is a major, major ethical violation, and is a reportable ethical violation by a lawyer. You have to report the bar when this happens. You report to the bar when this happens to you. A lot of attorneys say, oh my God, I'll cover it up. And they'll just put in their own money and say, let's never speak of this again. And the scammer says, I got you. I got the money, and you'll never go to the police because you lose your license when you go to the police. I got you. Great scam. Of course, we saw it coming because we deal with scams. So when we saw this, it's like, oh yeah, I know what this is doing. So it was interesting though that it's very prevalent. How does this happen in the Chinese American community? Often with affinity fraud, where something like this is with international transfers of, I'll give you this check, or I'll give you this cashier's check, you deposit it into your account, and then you remit the other part to the relative, and then that check bounces, but you've already remitted the funds and it drains the account. Or you do an international wire, or you do something like that. So this exists in the Chinese community, and we see this every once in a while. And it's not as necessarily as sophisticated as the lawyer scam, but it operates on the same principle of that it breaks down that wall of you saying, well, I'm not going to join some stupid Bitcoin thing. I'm not going to join some hokey investment. But these, where they say, well, you're not actually investing anything, you're just helping me transfer. I give you $100 and then you give him the $100 and it's all even. You're just doing me a favor. You're just helping me out. Come on, we're friends, do me a favor. I see that one fairly frequently, and it works on the overdrafting principle. One of the payments bounces. So just to throw those two out there, because they're certificate of independent review and then the overdraft fraud.
好的，谢谢 Michael 的补充啊。那这个我们接下来还是讲一下这个关于遗产规划啊、财产规划的这方面的一个问题，就是说，这个我觉得圣诞新年应该是我们家庭大家都就是在一起的一个时候，get together 的一个时候。那 Michael，do you think now is a good time when you get together with your family members for Christmas, for New Year to talk about estate planning and how should we bring up the issue? Because for Chinese people, I think usually people don't want to think about what if something happened to me. How do we bring up this issue for during the holiday season?
Well, I'm probably not going to bring it up over Christmas dinner, I'll tell you, and I do this as a job. But I say it is something to think about, because the holiday season tends to bring families together. Oftentimes some family members that we haven't thought about, that we don't see so often. I have them in my family. My father has a big family, 3 brothers and a sister, big extended family. And holidays bring everybody together. One of the things that can start in the mind is to say, gosh, does Uncle Joe, does Aunt Susan, does she do any planning? Maybe when the holidays die down, maybe things get a little calmer, we should have a chat. Why should we have a chat? Relatives like Aunt Susan or Uncle Joe and things like that aren't married, or they were married and divorced, or married and their spouse has already passed away. If something happens to them and there's no planning and they pass intestate, this can create kind of a mess. And this can become a problem, is that the assets are not well designed. And particularly with that situation, I had this situation, real case. Uncle Joe and Aunt Susan, we'll have them a married couple this time. They never had children. Susan passes away year one. Joe and Susan were a couple for 60 years. Once she left, he said, well, I'm going too. He dies in year two. You would think that the estate, if they do no planning, goes from Susan to Joe's family. And in this situation, Susan was from Latin America and had never seen her family for years and years and years. And Joe was from America, lived here for years and years. You would think that the assets would just go to Joe and then it would all go to his American family. No. California operates on what's called the predeceased spouse rule. Even though Susan passed away first, and then Joe was the survivor, it went from Susan to Joe, and then when Joe passed, it resplit under the intestate system. And then it went, Joe's parents were deceased, his siblings. It went, Susan's parents were predeceased. Her siblings, my understanding from the family was she left Latin America because she never wanted to see them again. But they were the heirs. And it was a relatively large estate. There are these companies that basically search for heirs, and they figured out that this was live. And they found those heirs, and they found them, and they charged them 30% of the inheritance and say, we'll represent you and get your share. And, somebody in, Venezuela says, wait, I get $1 million from America for like nothing. It's like, yeah, it was Susan. And oh yeah, Susan who left Venezuela because we had so much fighting. Oh, that's funny, but I will take the $1 million. That's what happened. And so this is something that we can have some problems with. So thinking about that during the holiday times, thinking as people will ask, get a bit older, thinking about parents, grandparents, making appropriate planning. It's never too early to start. Do you broach the topic? I wouldn't. I'd wait a week or two. But it is something to think about because, again, having a settled estate can prevent disharmony. So again, we hope these times though the holidays coming up are a harmonious time. What can cause fractures is problems with this. So approach it.
所以今天晚上 Michael 负责举例子，我最后给大家再总结一下啊，拿中文再总结一下，就是我们为什么就一直跟大家强调的是说，在你意识清醒的时候，在你头脑清醒的时候，你把你自己的 plan 给做好。因为首先这个我们很多朋友，如果是我们客户我们现在的客户肯定都知道的，就加州最基本的是它会有一个 probate 遗产认证程序。那大多数的州呢，其实都有相应的一个 probate 的程序啊。但是在加州呢，这个 probate 的法庭程序尤为是一个你需要考虑做遗产规划信托的一个原因。原因就是说，它的这个 probate 的费用呢，是根据你的总资产的一个百分比，所以它的这个 potential 的费用呢，可以是非常非常高的。那通过提前的遗产财产规划呢，你可以把这部分的费用呢，完全给避免掉。就是这个，就是从钱的角度，从 cost 的角度来讲的话啊，信托实际上是最好的去避免这个费用的这样的一种方式。当然呢，刚才 Michael 举的这个例子，也是我们一直跟大家去强调的，就是信托规划其实更重要的一点，在我们看来，这个费用当然也就是高昂的费用是一个很重要的原因，但是更重要的一点就是说，你做信托，你做你的遗产规划的一个最主要的原因，就是把你自己的命运掌握在你自己的手里，把你自己的资产掌握在你自己的手里，去避免一些意想不到的一些结果。像刚才 Michael 律师在他的这个案例当中讲到的这个例子啊，因为你没有做任何的规划，因为法律的规定或者是操作，那你去世的时候，你的资产可能到了一个在你生前根本就和你没有任何联系关联的亲戚的手里面，可能是非常远房的亲戚，或者甚至是你讨厌的一个人你憎恶的一个人那如果说是这样的一个结果的话，就是可能并不是你想要的，更何况要经过整个的这个繁琐的法庭的程序，这个你的资产在你整个的这个法庭程序当中，可能就很快的会蒸发掉。但是我觉得最重要的就是说，我们的资产其实是我们非常努力的去工作，或者说通过我们的投资啊，不管是各种方式去积累出来的，我们一生去积累出来的啊，我们的资产其实应该是在我们 过世的时候应该是给到我们想要给的人，或者说是甚至我们有一些客户他们非常 passionate about 一些慈善 charity 啊这些，就是说我觉得是用在这样的一些方面才能最大程度的就是这个 respect 我们自己这个毕生的付出啊，然后以及用我们的资产来去 take care 我们所关心的人。那所以呢，我觉得提前做好的规划，在我们的意识清醒的时候去做好规划是非常非常重要的。我在实践当中，我觉得我遇到的最难的一种情况，就是我自己都觉得是非常就是 emotionally，我也觉得很难去处理的情况，就是有一些客户他他非常想做遗产规划，就是有的时候是家人给我们打电话，就是说他现在需要去做一份遗嘱信托这样的文件，但是呢，他现在已经在 ICU 里面了，或者说他现在突然发生一个意外，他已经意识不清醒了。那这个时候呢，我们作为律师呢是不可以帮客户去做任何的事情的。因为你做遗产规划这些法律文件的话，它本身是需要当事人是要有清醒的意识，需要他有足够的这个意识行为能力，我们才可以帮你去做这个文件。但是在这种情况下，我们作为律师的话，如果我们帮你去做这个文件，我们是违背我们的职业道德的，我们没有办法去帮你做。所以呢，所有的人，我觉得就是说，就是在意识清醒的时候，去把你最想要的这个结果写在纸上，我觉得这个是一个最好的未雨绸缪的一个安排，而并不是说就是说这个如果发生了什么事情，想着这个临时抱佛脚啊，这个是不可取的啊。然后另外一个就是说，我们做遗产规划有的时候就是我们也一直跟客户讲，你的遗产信托文件并不是说只有在你去世的时候才会发生作用，因为现在我看到的情况就是说，人的年纪其实是越活越大。我们的很多客户的话，他到了很大的年龄，他几十年以前做的信托，但是他现在还是就是非常健康的在这个生活着。但是人年龄越活越大的过程当中，他会有一个什么问题？就是你到了一定年龄的时候，你可能不想去 manage 你的 assets 了，你的资产，你可能觉得说我没有这个精力去管理，或者说有一些客户就是我们今天开头讲的这个金融诈骗的问题，其实他年纪大的人特别怕，有的人特别怕说我自己的钱被别人骗走了，或者说他这个他们家里的人很怕他被骗。就是前段时间我们还有一个客户，他们是这个家族企业家族的生意，然后妈妈其实一直以来都是一个特别能干的，就是他们家之所以这个生意做得这么好，也是因为妈妈就是一个特别能干的一个人。然后但是妈妈就是有的时候特别能干的人，她就一直不想退休，但是她现在已经就是到大概80多岁了这样一个年龄，而且尤其是她现在呢又找了一个就是比她小很多的一个这个男朋友吧，所以她家里的子女都特别担心她妈妈被这个被骗啊，金融资产上这方面被骗，所以就是说这个怎么去做一些提前的这个安排，然后呢，在你这个年纪大了的时候，没有办法去 manage 自己的 assets，或者说有一些情况下，我们这个在湾区看到的也是常见，就是会见到的这种现象，就是有一些客户他会 develop 一些这个可能 dementia 或者说是 Alzheimer's 一些症状啊。那这个时候可能你就不宜去 manage 你的 financial assets 了，可能就是由你的配偶啊、小孩啊或者其他的你信任的人来去帮你去 manage 可能会更好。但是这个时候，如果说你再去做你的信托遗产规划的话，可能你就没有相应的 capacity。这个能力去做了，但是如果是这之前你做过一些安排的话，那这个时候你的这个遗产信托规划 estate planning 到什么就可以 kick in，可以帮助你。所以这里呢，就是重新跟大家重温一下啊，为什么我们要做遗产信托规划的一个原因。至于其他的就是有一些客户有一些另外的一些需求的话，在一定程度上有一些类型的信托可以帮你去解决这个问题。你比如说有一些客户，有遗产税的问题，你就是属于高资产净值的人群，你的资产里面有一部分可能要这个，如果说不提前做规划的话， 你要缴40%的遗产税。如果是你是这种的话，那可能我们要做一些特别的一些规划，去帮你去规避遗产税啊。那还有一种客户呢，他做信托可能是因为一些资产保护的原因。那说到资产保护呢，这里面就是我特别就是想和大家去分享一个我们在实践当中，就是我们认为从资产保护角度来讲的话，特别好的一个意见和一个建议吧啊，就是我觉得我们每一个人每一个家庭都应该买一份 umbrella insurance 伞险。那我们请 Michael 介绍一下什么叫伞险？那伞险它有哪些的作用？What is umbrella insurance and why everybody needs to consider umbrella insurance?
Yes, this is a great thing to think about in increasing your insurance protection, and something that we often request clients to think about when they approach us with questions about asset protection and LLCs. And this is actually something, if those of you who have LLCs, you may want to put a star by this one. So essentially, when we have liability insurance and casualty insurance, there's the homeowner's insurance plus our automobile insurance. Oftentimes, this is bundled together, and there is a bundling of the automobile and the homeowner's insurance. What the insurance companies can often do is also offer umbrella insurance, which is essentially from the basic policy of insurance, increasing the amount up to a substantial amount. Sometimes, $1, $2, $3 million. There are, in specialty situations, sometimes even $5 million umbrella policies. Those may be a little bit too much for most persons, but can have a place. And essentially what this does is it bumps up the maximum liability protection that you have for casualty insurance, particularly with regard for automobile injuries. So, auto accidents, accidentally hitting somebody with the car. So this can be very good insurance for that situation if there's an automobile accident, because it places potentially several $million between you and the claimant. Often it's also quite inexpensive. Thinking about this for LLCs and the issue with regard to LLCs is many people use LLCs to hold rental real estate. That can be a very good idea, particularly if it is commercial. But be cautious if you are considering or already have rental real estate in LLCs, and you have an umbrella policy or are thinking about an umbrella policy. Check in with your insurance provider and your insurance broker to see, does the umbrella extend to accidents or injuries occurring within that LLC? Often it won't. So you have to check. Sometimes you can add it by adding a rider or do different things or cover it in another way, but that can be a limitation with LLCs in some circumstances where the insurance would be not a complete coverage to where the risk would come from.
对，所以就是我前段时间我们有接过一个咨询，就是一个案例啊，这个是当然也是我们这个做过了很多的这个案例当中的一个，就是很不幸的是发生了一个 accident 的一个车祸事件，因为说实在的，我们每个人都在开车，那开车的话，这个发生 accident 的这个几率还是非常高的。然后这个人呢，他就很不幸的就发生了一个 accident，然后他就把人给撞得很严重啊。那这个时候呢，就是他当然就是整个这个 case 经历了 personal injury attorney 啊，经历了整个的这个 process， 经历整个 process 之后，那当然就是说他的保险因为非常 coverage 非常 basic， 然后也没有刚才 Michael 讲的 umbrella insurance 这些，那所以现在呢就他拿到就是保险公司相当于是已经放弃了，就是帮他去做任何其他的一些 defend， 因为他的保额就是只有那么多，具体的多少我这个数字我不太记得了，大概可能是10万块钱，就非常非常低。但是他的那个 judgment 呢是非常高的，几百万。那这个人呢，他实际上是有很多的其他的资产的，因为他们夫妻2个人都是 湾区的工程师啊，而且年纪也比较大，所以其实是积累了很多的资产，包括房产啊这些。那像他这样的这个资产呢，都是可能被成为这个追债的对象的啊。所以实际上，就是发生了这样的一个情况的话，就是我觉得就是从对受伤的人负责的角度，以及对你自己从这个资产保护的角度来讲的话，没有什么比一个大额的保险更好的一个解决的方案，一个 solution。所以我觉得就是说，从整个社会的各个方面，我们都会推荐客户，就是说，一定考虑在你的资产保护的规划当中，考虑加上 umbrella insurance。加上你的保险的这个部分，说到保险，其实有很多种，我们生活当中各种各样的保险，像这个健康保险、人寿保险、房屋保险啊，所有的这个保险，我个人就是意见啊，就是说大家就是这个所有的资产保护，所有的对你的个人的这个方面的保护，任何的东西，我都觉得说是这个先以保险为主，保险实际上是最好的一个解决方案。如果比如说发生什么事情，保险公司也有他们的律师团队，然后帮你去解决这样的问题。那就 compare to 说你自己要去找律师，然后花律师费。那相对来讲的话，这个整个的 cost 的成本各方面都是非常高的。所以，说到资产保护，就是我们很多客户都会有这方面的一些咨询，比如说，这个很多人很注重自己资产的隐匿性，不想让别人知道说我有多少资产，或者说他从事了一些高危的行业，那他可能想做一些资产保护方面的一些规划，甚至是就是说人有这个旦夕祸福，就是这种一般的我们讲的这种这个 car injury accident 这些的话，那很多客户有这方面资产保护的一些需求。那当然，资产保护你可以分成不同的一些 level 来去做啊。有这个当然首当其冲的我认为就是你应该考虑的就是先从保险的角度来去考虑。那在保险之上的话，当然你可以去找律师去做一些相应的一些法律的架构。但是这些法律架构呢，你在做的过程当中都会发现，它可能是要有一些的 cost 在里面，或者说你要可能牺牲一些东西，就是说你不能什么人嘛，我觉得你不能什么都想要，什么好处都想捡着，总有一些东西你可能你在这个过程当中，你可能你的 focus 如果说是资产保护的话，可能你要放弃一些东西。那我们作为律师来讲的话，我会给你 analyze 说你可能要放弃哪些。那如果说你觉得说是值得的，你 balance 下来，你平衡下来，你觉得说这么做是值得的话，那我觉得你就选择去按照我们给你建议的这个 plan，你去做。但是在最前面的，我们会建议说你先去考虑这个从保险的这个角度去解决这个问题啊。OK，那就是这个关于资产保护的这个部分，就先跟大家讲一下。在这个过程当中，如果说大家有什么问题的话，我们今天也这个会拿出5分钟跟大家讲一下这个问题啊。然后我们不会开麦克风，所以您有问题就是把您的问题打在这个 Q&A 里面。那最后呢，我觉得这是第三块的话题。我们之前上一次讲座也有跟大家在一定程度分享过，而且我们还请了会计师啊过来跟大家一起分享，就是这个年终岁尾，那大家肯定会有一些想要做的一些税务方面的一些规划，因为又到年底了，那这个到明年的时候，大家又要缴今年的税，那今年我们是不是有一些事情，就是说 Michael 可以提醒一下我们的 audience？And then you can remind our audience by the end of the year about tax planning.
Well, essentially, we're about 15 days out. There are a few things that one can do. The things that I usually you recommend doing before.
Sorry, Michael, just to interrupt. I suddenly remember，就是我的那个我跟大家说一下，就是我这个说到这个年底的这个事情，就是如果说你要给学校捐款的话，就是我提醒大家要尽快去捐款，因为我今天刚刚有收到 我们家小朋友的学校那个给我们发的
charitable contribution.
对，把那个捐款的这个信息发给我的时候，就跟我讲说，哦，你如果要捐款的话，你必须得要是在12月20号之前要捐好，因为如果是12月20号之后的话，我们就不能给你提供任何的 receipt。然后因为我们的 office 不工作了，然后你就没有 receipt，那你可能今年就没法 deduct 了。所以说，如果说你想给学校捐款或者慈善机构这个捐款的话，如果现在还有15天，还有大概15天的时间，你想去做捐款的话，你最好这个问一下他们啊，然后是不是还可以给你把这个就是他们的这个 receipt 这个 system。怎么去 work？ 因为有一些方式的话，他们可能会 flexible。你比如说用 credit card 之类的，它可能没有那么严格。但是如果说这个什么 ACH 啊什么的，它如果它这种尤其大的机构，它有一个 policy，它不给你这个，那你可能就有一点麻烦啊。所以这里提醒大家一下。Sorry, Michael, you can continue.
Oh, the classic things are just the items that are required to be done within the tax year. So charitable contributions, that's a key one. Front-loading deductions, if you have a business or you're able to take deductions, do the purchases now that they're in the year 2023, because if you buy everything January 2nd, it counts into the next year. So if you're going to do deductions, front load those. And then if there are any assets that if you have capital gains and you realize capital gains and you have some losers in your portfolio, that today and yesterday were pretty good days on the market, I have to say. If you have losers and you say, actually, you know what, I'm going to sell some of the winners, I'm going to harvest those gains, you may want to harvest the losses too, and dump the losers. So it looks like getting a few questions here if we want to pivot over.
Oh yes, let me see. 第一个问题是想请教一下律师关于婚前财产的问题。在共同财产中，如果两人结婚前一方用全款买了一套1 million 的房子，当两人解除婚姻关系时，此时房子值2个 million， 这2个 million 应该如何分配给双方？另外一
I
种
think I
情况是
understand this question. If you
婚前一方付了20%的首付。OK, go ahead.
All right. This is a community property question. So question number one that we have is about community property. So for everybody joining us, this is the way California community property works in a nutshell. Again, family law lawyers will go into this in much greater detail, but for our purposes, just as a question, we can provide this information. So California community property that you acquire before marriage in full is separate property. And anything that after you marry that you receive by inheritance or gift is also separate property. But once one marries, everything that one acquires through labor, through your work, that's part of the marital community. So we have our simple rule. If before marriage, I inherit a property from my parents, or I just buy a property and I pay it free and clear, and it's free and clear, and I have this particular property. The example here was saying, you know, it was $1 million, and then during my marriage it increased in value to 2 million. Well, the question is going to be, is that property still separate property? If it operated like this, that I purchased it before marriage, it's worth $1 million, and during my marriage, we didn't live there. There was no mortgage on it. There was no loan. And the property tax and all of the utilities, there was a renter in there, and I had a separate bank account, and that rent went into the separate bank account, and that paid for the property tax, and that paid for the utilities, and that basically was totally siloed away from my community property. That will remain separate property. And even though that separate property went from $1 million to 2 million, it doubled in value during our marriage. If it remains separate property, then it's still separate property if we divorce. But the key is this community property asset, this salt water, cannot go into the fresh water. When the salt water goes into the fresh water, it becomes salt water. It contaminates it. So that's going to the second example I buy the property for $1 million. I have $1 million of equity that's originally mine. And then I begin living there with my wife and using our community property to pay down the mortgage, and we're paying down the mortgage. It's increasing in value. In that case, it's going to have a community property problem. My spouse is going to have a significant claim to the mortgage payments. And a lot of people will argue that they'll say, oh, well, just add up the mortgage payments and subtract out half. Well, she's going to argue, she's a smart lawyer, that she's going to say, well, that was also an investment that we were making those payments. So I want my half of the equity. So you're going to have a mess in that situation. You would have to do a premarital agreement or do a post-marital transmutation agreement to solve those things. So it's complicated.
首先我得强调的是，就是因为我们认识好多这边做 family law 离婚的一些律师，就是在离婚的时候，而且我们经常做的一个 scenario 实际上是，就是客户在离婚的过程当中，在离婚的过程当中，他们需要去做一些 estate plan，因为如果说你在离婚的过程当中，你的离婚还没有 finalize，没有 complete，这个期间如果你发生任何事情，如果你不做任何 plan 的话，你的资产可能是还是给你的这个 divorce，就是还没有离成婚的 spouse，所以你在离婚期间去做这个 estate planning，其实是一个特别特别重要的一件事情。然后我们实际过程当中也做很多这种案子啊，因为很多离婚律师也会把这种案子 refer 给我们，就是为了他们自己的客户的利益。所以我这里面就是我给 Michael 律师刚才讲的，我补充一点的是说，即使是第一种情况，听起来好像是非常的 crystal clear，但是在实践的过程中 ，you never know，因为有的时候，这个在离婚的时候，首先大家经常的这个关系都是非常糟糕的，然后为了资产，为了小孩的抚养权，各种问题都会产生特别大的一些争气。那他可能就是即使哪怕是你全款买的这一套房子，我们之前也看到过，就是这个律师会argue 说，他可能这么多年也有去 manage 这个房子，那你 manage 这个房子的话，那可能就是你的 labor built in 到你的这个房子里面去，也会可以做这种 argument，只是说相比之下的话 ，Michael 讲的第二种的 situation 会更加的对于你来说就是不利。所以你不要就是在任何的，就是在加州，在任何的情况下，在离婚的过程，如果说，就是即使说实话，就是哪怕你有婚前协议，你签了，我也看到过，就是你签了婚前协议，你签了 marital agreement，但是这些协议被法院所推翻，然后或者说有各种各样的问题。那如果你连这种协议都没有的话，其实如果说一方或者双方没有办法去达成协议的话，整个的这个 process 在财产分割当中都是没有那么 clean 的，都不是就是会特别的，就是什么 black and white law 这种 no。所以就是我觉得，这个。所以其实有的时候有一些客户也会讲说，就觉得这个在结婚之前要考虑很多很多问题，但是有另外一种做法，就是说我也不用考虑那么多的，这当然就是各种情况了。如果说你结婚之前你的资产已经有了一定的资产，然后或者说这个是你的第二段婚姻，或者你有小孩，或者就是这种情况的话，可能你确实要慎重的去考虑一下，就是说你第一要不要去注册结婚，然后第二如果要注册结婚的话，你要不要签一个婚前协议，然后第三的话，你在婚后你的行为上是不是要严格的去规制自己，去隔离你的资产，这些都是一系列的一些问题啊。一定要找专业的律师去咨询。如果说你有任何的问题，否则的话就会有一些意想不到的一个结果。那第二个问题呢，这个客户是问说关于就是说就是我们之前讲座当中有提过 step basis，然后说这个 step basis 虽然可以帮助客户去 avoid capital gain tax，但是从遗产税这边的话。那还是会有问题的。所以这个客户问 What is the benefit of standing basis if it cannot lower the estate tax?
Well, we have two different tax systems in play here. And actually the benefit of the step up in basis is quite significant, because if you didn't have a step up in basis, you'd pay pay the tax twice, essentially. So let's give the example like this. So what is the step up in basis? It is going to matter on the size of the estate, which we'll see in a moment. But so step up in basis, fairly simple concept. If I have a property, I buy it for $500,000. And I buy it for $500,000, it goes up to fair market value of $1 million. And again, let's not say it's a primary residence or any other exceptions apply. We're just saying the regular capital gains tax. If I, during my lifetime, sell it, I have to pay tax on $500,000 of gain. So because I bought it 500, and then it now is $1 million, so there's $500,000 of gain. So that would cause tax for me. If I gift the property during my lifetime, the recipient takes my basis, that person would have to pay capital gains tax on $500,000 when the property is sold. The capital gains tax only occurs when there's a realization event, there's a sale. So that is the basics of the capital gains tax. The capital gains tax basis is adjusted, the step up in basis, if I pass away. So if I'm old and I pass away, even though my basis was $500,000, my passing, the basis then becomes $1 million. So my heir, let's say it goes to my son the next day could sell the property for $1 million and he would pay no capital gains tax. So that's the step up in basis. Overlay the estate tax. We have no inheritance tax in the federal taxing system. Some states do it, like Minnesota, and other countries like Japan does an inheritance tax, but we don't do an inheritance tax. It's the estate. So how does this work for the estate? That exact same hypothetical. For that exact same hypothetical, we have the estate is now $1 million. Let's say it's individual and it's the person a U.S. citizen. The exemption this year is $12 million. It is under the estate tax exemption. So there's no estate tax due. That tax system drops away. It goes to my heir. And because of the step up in basis, there were no taxes at my death. There was no estate tax because the estate was under the exemption. And then that person, if they choose to sell it in that year and convert it to cash, they would not pay any capital gains tax. If you had a situation, let's say our estate tax exemption we'll lower it down, which is going to be after 2025. Let's say it's a base of $5 million. We have a $5 million estate. If I purchased the estate, the estate assets, let's say it's a big estate. I purchased the estate assets at $5 million, but when I pass away, it's $10 million. And let's say, assume it's all capital assets. It's just all capital assets. In that situation, the step up in basis would make the federal income tax basis for all that property $10 million. But there'd be an estate tax that would be on the $5 million over, that would be 40%. So how does this work? You'd have the total estate that would be 10 million. On 5 million of that, you'd have to take out 40%. So you'd have to take 40% out of that. So you'd have to take $200,000 there. But if my heir then sold all the assets, there would be no capital gains. So you would pay the estate tax, but there would be no capital gains tax. So it works like that.
OK， 所以step-up basis 实际上解决的是一个就是虽然它解决不了遗产税的问题，但是它实际上解决了一个很大的一个问题，就是关于你的资产利得税，尤其是如果你要卖房的，你去世了之后，你的子女卖房的这种情况。那 consider 呢，现在就是 Prop 19，我们知道 pass 了之后，其实如果说你在去世之后，你的资产、你的房产被重新评估，那其实很多你的尤其是投资房啊这种的，可能就没有办法去 produce 一个正向的现金流。 如果说他没有办法去 produce 一个正向的现金流的话，那作为你的 heir 去持有这个房产，可能就不是一个特别好的一个资产，那他可能就需要去卖掉。那他在卖掉的时候，如果说他有这个 status basis，那实际上是一个非常 valuable 的一个法律啊。所以这个还是有它的存在的非常大的意义在的。但是如果说你有 state tax 的问题的话，那你可能就需要通过一些其他的方式去做一些 planning 那这个本身你去靠 static basis 的话，这个是没有办法帮你去解决这个问题的。那接下来还有几个问题啊，我们再继续给大家回答，大概5分钟左右的时间。那如果说你有事情的话，你就可以离线，我们就明年再跟大家再见。然后这个祝大家有一个愉快的圣诞节和新年。那个屏幕上面是我们的联系方式，如果说你有任何问题的话，你可以联系我们啊。那我们接下来再给大家再回答几个问题。有的朋友问说，这个大概要买多少的 umbrella insurance？这个我觉得其实是就是你自己大概评估一下，你有多少的 assets 去 expose 到这个 risk，就是在 OK。
Okay. A couple of ways to think about it is the size of one's assets is a metric. So if one's net worth is about 2-3 million dollars, that's about right. But there's an interesting thing that happens, that there's a diminishing marginal returns as your estate becomes higher in value, because again, your liability is going to depend on the amount of damage that you cause. So you start to, once you hit 2 million, 3 million, and I think definitely $5 million, which is an unusual umbrella. That's an unusually large umbrella. Usually they're 1, 2, 3 million in that range. When you're over that, it is generally somewhat unlikely that one would get into an accident where you would have more than $2.5 million of liability. One would have to be, doing something, quite reckless to incur that kind of liability. So what I would say is, thinking of net wealth is a metric, but there's a diminishing marginal return as it goes up, because it's unlikely to have so much, unlikely to cause so much damage. So if you say, oh, I'm a $20 million estate, do I need $20 million of umbrella? I'd say no.
但是我觉得就是我们加州就是在美国托尔茨就侵权法其实也是很厉害的，就是我们经常看到那种天价的赔偿10个 million、20个 million 的这个，我觉得这个也是存在的。但是我们从律师的角度来讲，我们只是说可能更常见的是这个 up to 5 million，刚才 Michael 讲这样的一个情况，但是我们不能讲说没有看到过更多的一些侵权法的赔偿的存在。像之前我有看过，就是说之前有一个 liability 是把一个就是跳舞特别好的一个孩子的腿给砸断了，那个是芝加哥的一个案例嘛，那个好像是赔了，也是上千万的啊，这样的一个赔偿。那接下来有这2个问题，我可以给大家简单的先就是回答一下，就是说关于是否如果你做完信托以后跟你的子女去交流的这样的一个问题啊，这个我觉得就是完全的取决于你们的家庭的情况。我们有一些客户的话，他特别 transparent，特别 open，然后可以跟自己的子女去讲所有的事情，一切的事情。如果是这样子的话，我觉得就是说，你可以非常 openly 跟你的小孩去 discuss 说，我的信托的内容是什么，然后我信托的里面的安排是什么，我的资产有哪些，这些你都是可以跟你的小孩讲。但是我还有另外一部分的客户呢，他们就会觉得说，我的资产是我的资产，应该是一个非常私人的一个事情。我的小孩可能我给他支付了学费，支付了上大学的费用，我觉得我就已经完成了我的，剩下的我的这些钱就是这个我应该 享用这些钱啊。然后如果说剩下来的话，那就是给我的小孩。那我可能不想让我的小孩知道说我的资产的全部有多少，也有这样的家长。那还有一部分的家长呢，就会比较担心说，那如果说我跟我的小孩讲了说我有多少钱，那这个也是活生生的例子啊，我们也看到过很多这种案例，就是你有的家庭跟小孩讲了说，OK，爸爸妈妈有这些钱什么，然后小孩就觉得说。尤其在湾区，可能大家这个很多小孩从小生活条件都特别好，然后就觉得说我可能就不需要再做其他的任何的事情，再去努力去工作了。然后因为爸爸妈妈已经有这么多的资产要给我，我就可以躺平了。也有这样的小孩。那如果是这种情况的话，那可能如果说你觉得你的小孩会有这样的一些行为的话，那你可能不太适合把你的实际的更多的情况，然后跟你的小孩全部的都说出来啊。这就是不同的家庭不同的情况，根据你的实际的需要来。那你的信托呢，应该是放在非常安全的地方。那你的信托放在哪里呢？其实应该你的信托的序位的信托的管理人啊，你的受益人其实都应该知道的啊。因为以前我们也有案例，就是说人出事了之后找不到信托的，信托相当于白做了，或者说你的信托不当的保管，给了一些去篡改你的资产财产安排的人提供了一些机会。那这个也是一个就是比较大的一个问题，所以信托的妥善保管呢也是非常重要的。那还有一个问题呢，就是关于说是如果说配偶不同意去做信托的话，那你是不是可以去做信托？那这个实际上呢，就是要看你的资产的实际的性质了啊。如果说你的资产的性质是夫妻两个人的共同的资产的话，那可能如果一方不同意你自己去做信托的话，这个可能就是比较艰难的。但是如果说你的资产都是你的个人的一些资产，那你可能不需要经过对方的同意，你也可以去做信托，做一些信托的安排。OK，那
And
就这
try
些。
to and on that one, try to convince your spouse if it just make sure you don't hold anything as tenants in common. Try to hold things as community property, and then you do your revocable living trust. If something happens, the other person's assets will pour into yours, and then yours will be taken care of your revocable living trust. If something happens to you, your trust will take care and deal with your stuff. So that would be a good way to do it.
然后有朋友问说，这个关于升值的这个房子的这个部分，是不是算成共同的财产？这个我觉得就是说我建议，如果说这个您有这方面的问题，还是具体的要问一下 family law attorney。但是就是就像我刚才跟您这个讲的，就是其实在这个实际的分割的过程当中是非常非常复杂的，就是双方都会各执一词，然后这个有各种的这个 argument，然后也有一些 exception，然后去说这个关于资产的划分的问题啊。所以具体的这个情况有很多的不同的 circumstance 都会影响到最后的结果。所以这个具体可能要了解更多的情况，然后再具体的再去做分析。但是可能就是真的是没有一个完全的 black and white 的一个答案。那还有一个问题呢，这个 Michael 可能你来回答一下。这个是我们之前有一个客户在我们讲座之前就说需要我们回答一下这个问题啊，就是 suppose one day I were incapacitated. My caregiver takes me down to the courthouse and marry me, even though I have no idea what has happened, and my kids don't know I got married to the caregiver. 这个是关于 caregiver 的一个问题啊。那 how to prevent the caregiver from inheriting my estate when I pass away? What provisions need to be included in my living trust to prevent the caregiver from inheriting my estate?
What one of the first things to do under this situation, as one's getting older, especially if I'm not married and if one has kids, this is very good. This could be a real big problem if I don't have children and I have to rely on others. But first thing is establish your estate plan. That's the first thing. When you're of sound mind and are able, establish your plan. The second thing that one can do as one gets older, if you have high trust with a child, is as I get older, and if I think I have some concerns, about capacity, or I just say, I'm getting, I've reached, God willing, I reach 80 or so. I say, okay, it's time. Consider adding a child as a co-trustee with yourself, because revoking a living trust will require notice to the two trustees. So if you have a situation where, of course, you're the settlor, you have the right to revoke, and you get the caregiver or somebody in there trying to cause trouble. If there's a co-trusteeship, particularly for real estate, if we go, Michael Lee to himself, and then all of a sudden as trustee, and then I say, okay, I better do it, Michael Lee and Susan Lee as co-trustees of the house, that's going to require Susan's signature to take it back out of the trust. So that can be a situation. Add a co-trustee in there. Some people consider irrevocable trusts. That's kind of extreme, but you could go to that. That if you say, I've had a client like this. He was an older gentleman, and he said, "Oh, Mike, I'm going to do something stupid with the estate. I know it. I get into trouble. I roam around, and I have a family, history of my family tends to do this." They said, at a certain point, we're going to do irrevocable trust. Eventually, we did, and we did an irrevocable trust for that situation. I think the co-trustee situation is better. The other thing, this is more of an additional strategy, though it requires input of children, is try to create an ecosystem where this won't happen. I know, again, try to say, see, here's the problem, just don't have the problem. But the answer is, if you have an ecosystem like this, of saying, have greater contact or some sharing of your estate plan and your activities with your children or the persons that you care about, particularly some involvement. And this can be done through a healthcare directive that grants HIPAA authority immediately, where capacity levels are known to the kids or accessible. I've had this for some families where we have these concerns, and we say, there's a healthcare directive, and we say, we actually ask the physicians and say, can you document capacity memory issues so that we're aware of this issue? I had a client who had a stroke, and it was important to document what had happened. Why do we document it? If suddenly the caregiver goes and marries me, my kids have evidence that they say, Mike was not all together after the stroke, and he had the stroke in 2017, and then she pulled him away and married him in 2023. He was not in good shape by then. And you have a doctor that said, yeah, after 2017, Mike wasn't all together. So that ecosystem, and then trying to create an estate plan that guards against that. Again, power of attorney, healthcare directive, and the revocable living trust, and then creating the ecosystem so those documents are actually effective. That works really well. The other thing mentions about things like I-bonds and things where they're held jointly. The joint designations take over the estate plan. So if I hold jointly, it will go under the estate plan, and it would be a premarital asset, so it wouldn't be community property. So if I purchased like a high interest account and it was earning interest, that's not my labor. That's from the asset earning the interest. So that wouldn't be community property. That would stay separate property, and that would go the joint way. If I was working and accumulating money into an account, and I held it joint with a child, and I passed away and it was joint with a child, my spouse could claim that as community property in some situations, that it wasn't all mine to give away. So that would be the thing to think about there.
然后说到joint joint 这种 ownership，就是你在就是有很多人觉得这是一种 easy way，你可以去avoid 一些 trouble，因为如果我过世了，另外一个人就可以拿到责任。但是在实践当中的话，我们见过了太多太多的客户，他其实是误选这个选项，有很多的问题。比如说，如果你失去意识行为能力的情况下，怎么去做一些决定，尤其是房产上面。 然后再一个就是说你本身的这种安排其实并不是很合适。比如说我们看到过就是有不是夫妻、父母、子女的这种情况，而是这个其他的亲属这种那用这种方式来去继承的话，实际上是一个就是不是大家想要的一种结果啊。所以你在做任何的这个 joint ownership 的时候，你都要去特别的小心。如果说你有任何问题的话，你应该去找专业的人士去咨询。那最后一个问题呢，因为时间也比较晚了，最后一个问题我在这里就简单的回答一下，就是说有的客户问说这个有多少 copy 的 living trust 呢？你可以 keep 啊。嗯，这个就是因为现在的这个 technology 的原因，其实有的时候我们所说的这个 copy 不见得是一个 physical copy，你可以就是一个电子的 copy 这种，但是 in any case 你要有你的文件的 original，如果你的文件的 original 原本你的 notary 的这些东西如果丢失的话，在你去世的时候或者你失去意识行为能力的时候，都会是一件非常非常麻烦的一件事情。呃，这个你本身你做这个文件的目的就是为了避免法庭程序，避免任何的麻烦。但是如果说你没有这个原件的话，那实际上你就会 defeat一部分的 purpose，你为什么要去做这个文件？当然，就是这个很多的一些就是这个就涉及到一些比较复杂的法庭程序了。我们可以帮客户去做一些事情，但是呢，永远呢你要注意的是，我们一再跟客户强调的是，你一定要保存好文件的原件。OK，那我们今天的讲座呢就到这里结束了啊，非常感谢大家在这一年当中对我们的支持，那也祝大家有一个愉快的节日，然后我们明年再和大家相聚啊，明年的1月底的那个周三，我们会和大家呢做我们2024年开年的第一个讲座。好，也谢谢 Michael 今天参加我们的会议。
Good night, all. Take care.
Good night.